Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's Yadamoose here, and we did a Remnant 2 challenge using secondaries only, but this time we had a twist, and we set up some rules that I think you'll really enjoy, and they were a lot of fun to do. Let's set the scene a little bit here and lay out the rules of the run. 1. I cannot deal damage with anything but secondaries. This includes mods and archetypes. Number 2, I must beat the game start to finish using the secondary only. And number 3, if for any reason I deal non-secondary damage, I restart. 4, new character to start, as well as any time rule 3 kicks in as well. Also, number 5, we did veteran difficulty as the minimum, but we ended up playing on Nightmare just to spice things up just a little bit. 6, we have to keep a melee weapon equipped at all times to make the stakes even higher. 7, I may only use the cube weapon if I have no other options, and I must switch in the middle of the battle, which means most likely this weapon isn't really gonna be too helpful, but I figured I'd put it in just to make sure I had some options in the event that I ran out of ammo and I didn't have any other choice. I had no other ammo boxes, and I had no money to actually buy any other ammo boxes as well. So let's get right into the video. Thanks, Pass Me. I appreciate that. Here, I created my character. I didn't put too much depth into it. I figured I would die more than I actually did during the run, or have to restart many times, and didn't want to go through that process too much, so I decided to keep it simple was the best option. So we have ourselves a beautiful looking character here, and I actually ended up selecting the Nightmare difficulty just to make it a bit harder on myself. I also selected the Medic archetype because this would end up being a massive boon through the run, and overall, the other archetypes would have caused some issues at the run, so we made a good choice here. I started off in Ward 13 as all Remnant 2 adventures tend to do, in which I quickly ran over to our good friend Brabus to see how much a weapon would cost, as replacing the service pistol that the Medic starts with would be something I needed to prioritize quickly. Shortly after, I ended up taking off my primary weapon as well, just to ensure that when I did run out of ammo, it didn't auto-swap my weapon and cause issues later in the run. The first world I ended up getting was Loathsome, and I got the Beatific Palace, which is the royal version of this area. Starting was rough. There ended up being way more ads in each area than I had initially thought, and as I attempted this a few times, I learned that really quickly that running through was going to be essential, as it got overwhelming very fast. A lot of these guys were not going down in a small number of shots, so getting slapped around was inevitable here. And this is about how the first few attempts at this actually went. Here is the first boss of the run. This is the Bloat King. I didn't struggle with this boss too much, thankfully. I also had the Silverback secondary during this fight, which really helped out damage-wise. The orbs that this boss sends out can do some damage if enough of them hit you. The Medic archetype came in handy with the healing pool and mitigated most of that damage. There was also the pool below full of the smaller version of this boss. I had to traverse that often in order to get ammo, because by this point in the run, I had almost no money. Surprisingly enough, this guy dropped tons of ammo, so that was never really a problem throughout the fight. It was more of a matter of getting to it. The lasers that this boss throws out were a bit difficult just because one is a tracking laser that follows you, and the others are things that you need to be dodged in time, which slower reaction time on keyboard and mouse made that a bit difficult. As we played more and more, this got easier, but since it's still relatively new, there were many times I messed up and took hits that I probably didn't need to. But with so much healing available relatively early on, it made it much easier to take those hits and recover from them. Overall, I took this boss down in only a couple of runs, and I was off to the next in no time. Next up, we have our first world boss encounter. This was Faelin. This boss is quite sharp. See what I did there? Anyway, he had quite the fake out moves, and this made it difficult, and often I would poorly time the dodges here, which made this take a few more tries than I would have initially liked here. Another issue we ran into early on was the sword orbs that this boss spawns. Initially, I ignored those to reserve my ammo, as I didn't know how often we would get drops, and I wanted to conserve ammo as much as possible during the fight, just to make sure I could actually beat this guy. A few runs in, I learned really quickly that getting hit with one of those was quite the setup for the boss to get an easy hit on me, which resulted in me dying a lot in this fight, so I quickly revised my strategy for this boss because getting hit back and forth like a ping pong ball was not on the agenda. Once I got past that, it made it easier to progress this boss into his later stages of basically just floating around like a spectral ball of light and letting his invincible swords do most of the work for him. This part was a bit rough as there was only a short window to get hits in, and then the swords come back down, so there was a lot of dodging that needed to happen with this later section, and I honestly thought this would be one of the harder fights of the run, but it turned out to be less tries than anticipated. Overall, I was able to push through and eventually bag myself a royal crown. After defeating Faelin, I could progress to the Labyrinth, which was the section of the game that would lead us to other worlds and would allow me to actually make more progress. This leads us to our next boss, the Space Cube. This one was really easy, and I didn't end up becoming a human pancake here, because we actually got this boss down within our first attempt, which was sort of surprising to me, just because I usually mess up one of the jumps, or some of the timing with the holes on the cubes, but that didn't happen on this run. So put away that syrup, there will be no breakfast served today. With this boss being one that doesn't really require actual damage to take down, I didn't have to do any farming or really any improvements to actually take this guy down, because all it took was one shot for each cube, and then it broke. This saved me a bit of money because by this point, I probably would have needed at least a couple of upgrades had this been a normal encounter. So with that all squared away, I was on to my next destination. Alright, let me tell you about this guy. This one is the one I like to call the diseased Meatball. I won't even give this thing the satisfaction of using its real name, because this was probably one of the worst fights of the run. First issue that I ran into with this encounter was the ammo. This boss took a certain number of hits before actually spawning any adds, so that made it hard because I really had to time my shots and make sure I didn't miss too many, otherwise the run was as good as dead. Second issue that I encountered was the boss did actually spawn any adds, it refused to run them over, and actually give me ammo, so I'd have to run around and try to get the boss to make some dough zombies before I could actually do damage at some points. The other part to that was when I did actually get ammo, most of the time it was wasted due to the boss running away and getting armor back almost as soon as I would knock it off. This was a huge waste of ammo and time, which oftentimes would cost me a run and would make me restart. Last and probably the worst thing about this boss was the combo that it always dished out. That drained a lot of stamina, and more often than not, at least one of the attacks would hit me, which made it easier for the adds to also hit me. So getting stun locked in this fight was a very regular occurrence. A good chunk of the time was spent here, and was not my best portion of this run. I probably could have done some farming to make this a bit easier, but I really just wanted to get this boss done with and be out of there. This blob of meat and metal can go to the plate of spaghetti in the sky and never be heard from again. The next encounter that I was supposed to take on was the world boss Tal'Ratha, otherwise known as this game's version of Jabba the Hutt. This encounter was rather difficult. When I went in there, the game decided to scale the area up much higher than any of my gear, which made my damage very minimal. The other portion of this fight was that my silverback really relied on hitting the weak spot on this guy, which is the mouth, and he didn't want to say cheese very often. Pictures aside, I made many attempts at this boss, but ended up getting rolled over more times than I would like to admit. So besides becoming a base for a pizza and waiting for my marinara, I thought about this and decided that I needed to do some more farming here, because the damage was not enough. There was also the issue of ammo on this fight. The silverback wasn't hitting hard enough for the amount of shots we had, which made this harder, coupled with the fact that the boss mostly wanted to just throw space junk at me instead of actually throwing adds to give me ammo, so that made this a bit more difficult to push through with how little damage I was doing by this point in the run. Especially considering that I couldn't even get this guy down enough to push him into his astral being phase, which made it shoot stars that tracked, and would have been a really bad battle of attrition. I really gave this one a try because my persistence wanted to push through this one really bad. But overall, the decision to leave was the best choice here, because getting an upgrade made this boss fight so much easier, which I will come back to later in the run. Goodbye, my largely mouthed friend. I will absolutely be back for you. So here we have an angry mob following us since we pretty much had to run through almost every ad section because of the ammo. I really have no idea how I managed to make it out of this, but these guys kind of just hurt each other, which I didn't realize, but it was kind of funny. There also happened to be a mini boss here, which I was not expecting at all, but we did get some resources out of that, which was the whole point of coming here, and to other places really, so it worked out for us, because I was actually planning on just resetting here, but free materials is something I can't complain about. We also got some stuff from that, which would help later in the run for adding a mutation to our weapon, which ended up being a small increase for damage, but any damage is better than nothing in this case. The fire guys here normally are much harder to deal with, but there must have been some sort of update that allowed them to do damage to each other, which again, helped out quite significantly here. If that hadn't happened, I would have most likely stuck to the original plan and reset this area before the boss battle I was about to face. Overall, there was plenty of bosses that I could have actually come across in Loathsome, but like I said earlier, there wasn't a plan to extend this journey out longer than I needed it to be, so keeping farming to a minimum, and bosses as well, was really the fastest way to do it. Plus, the more upgrades I got, the harder the game would end up becoming, so this made it so there wasn't too much of a power scale difference by the end of the run, and it was actually something I could do without maxing out the weapons I currently had. After suffering plenty of third-degree burns, I had to go back into the fire and deal with our next side encounter, Gwendil. This boss was very hard to hit with our weapon because we had to be precise, and since this boss had a gimmick of shooting the bomb out of their hand to explode and do extra damage, it was very hard to hit with such a precise weapon from the distance that we had available to us. After a few attempts of missing my shots very badly, I decided to use a weapon with a bigger hitbox. That was the right move here. Enter the Starshot pistol. This gun wouldn't be the one that was used for much outside this fight. However, it really helped in hitting the boss and was almost required to actually get that gimmick to work. As usual, the ammo struggle was real, but since the Starshot has more ammo normally, the pickup gave us more each time as well, so it was somewhat of a balance that I was able to maintain through this fight. Burn trauma aside, I got this one out of the way, richer than before, and was able to move on and get some more upgrades from this. Each boss has unique drops that usually make a mod or a weapon, but since we couldn't use much of that, most of it got sold for upgrades and ammo boxes, as we would need those more than anything else, so that was also a plus. On Yeisha, this was another example of how running through mobs went. These floating hentai monsters would shoot, slap, and pick me up super often. Getting through this section wasn't as hard as it probably should have been, but stamina was almost always out, and there was plenty of times I was running with the cheeks clenched. I made a poor attempt at the end there to try and defeat most of them, but there just wasn't a way that was actually gonna happen, so it ended about as expected, and the area got reset anyways. Here we have knockoff Shroud from the first Remnant game. This guy is not really too special, really just a small portion of this run. The challenge of this fight was the ads. Since the silverback only has 5 shots and it's a single load, I almost couldn't ever knock out all of the ads before some of them hashed, so sometimes the ads would be there along with the boss. Since the difficulty was higher than my gear was meant for, that was a lot of damage, so some runs just ended with me getting hit from multiple angles. Overall, not really much of a highlight, but this was one of the bosses I encountered, so it felt necessary to include. This boss is your mom. Nah, not really. It's actually called the Mother Mind, and as you would expect, this thing has a ton of spawns that make this difficult. This was really tough overall and took quite a bit of persistence here to come out on top. The main issue of ammo came in here far too often. Most of the time the spawns she would send out would fall into the abyss that was below the boss, so that meant that my ammo did as well. Most of the fight was having to rely on the boulders that came down from the ceiling to supply myself, even though most of the time the ones that dropped near me wouldn't actually give me anything and would just end up knocking me down. This resulted in a stun lock and ending the run. The other thing that I had to be mindful of was on occasion, the boss would shoot an AoE on the floor that would hurt quite a lot should I accidentally walk into it. Since the habit was already built to dodge in a direction, usually I would end up getting caught in one of those pools and take some heavy damage. This sometimes did end up costing a run. I had to revise my strategy a bit and make sure that when a boss did attempt to attack using its claws, that I either did a neutral backdash or I rolled backwards. This would ensure that I didn't take any extra damage through the fight. This boss also has a gimmick of breaking parts of the environment after losing a certain threshold of HP. This limited my walking space as well as how much ammo could drop from the ceiling. Usually once it got down to the last platform, I wasn't getting much ammo to actually continue the fight, so waiting around was a real struggle. Again, the medic archetype really came in handy through this fight of all the others, just because when I did take damage during those times where all I could do was wait, it was easy to recover it and not have to worry too much about getting taken out. This boss was probably the best example of persistence through the run, and honestly, I really like how this one turned out. If I were to say anything, this is probably the highlight of the run. Even though this normally isn't too difficult of an encounter under normal circumstances, this challenge made it quite a test of mettle. Welcome back, old friend. Finally back here to take on Jabba the Hutt once more. This time I came prepared. I swapped out my weapon for this and the last encounter to the Sure Shot pistol. This weapon sports just a single shot at any given time and then has to be reloaded, so basically running around with a one-handed musket. I was able to get quite a lot of materials through my journey in Losum and Yeisha, so that meant I had quite a lot of stuff to pour into this weapon. Most of the issue with upgrading came from the fact that the game leveled up most of the areas beyond what my new weapon needed for upgrades, and so I kept getting a lot of things that were for the higher level of upgrades instead of the lower ones. This ended up working out, as I would need them later anyways, but it was a bit rough at first to get the initial levels for this weapon. This is also the weapon I would be using through the rest of the run, as it has impeccable damage per shot and was worth having to reload constantly. Also, side note, if you hadn't noticed, I didn't include the Yeisha world boss. Well, I took the easy way out and decided to side with the Ravager for that instance and not fight him. This made it so there was no encounter, and I was off to the next place in no time. I could have done the encounter there. The only reason I opted not to was because once that boss gets low enough in health, he summons the roly-poly ads, and those guys are probably the worst ad in the game. So dealing with that, on top of a pretty tough boss fight using only a single shot weapon, would have been pretty bad. Here we have Cancer. Yeah, that's actually the name of the boss. Normally, this guy would be more difficult, and especially if he had tough modifiers, but I actually managed to get this one down first try. My dodges were mostly on the mark here, and I only took a damage a few times throughout the fight. This one was really easy if you just stick close and roll through most of the branches that pop up through the floor. This boss also does a glitch fake out sometimes, which can be hard to dodge if you don't know the timing, but it was pretty simple. I actually had fought this guy a lot on PlayStation, where I originally played this game. I did an apocalypse run in co-op, and the scaling in multiplayer is much different than one would expect. Usually when playing in multiplayer, you would kind of expect the encounter to get a bit harder per player, right? Well, in Remnant 2, the encounters get a lot harder. The boss also usually sports much more health as well. So for this encounter, I had quite a bit of training. Playing this game on Apocalypse in a co-op setting is very brutal. I would definitely recommend doing so solo if there was ever a time you were contemplating doing so yourself. By this point, there was only 2 more bosses left. After completing this fight, I was ready to go and finish this up. I was getting really close to finishing my first ever challenge run, and that to me was an amazing feeling. I was a bit nervous for the last boss because it can be a really tough fight sometimes. I knew the preparation would be needed before taking that on. So as we wrapped up this encounter, I was thinking of the preparations and upgrades I would need for the last stretch of this run. The second to last encounter we had is Venom. No, not the Marvel villain, even though that would be kinda cool. That aside, this boss has a pretty simple moveset. The one struggle that this boss usually comes with is most of the attacks that this guy throws out can one-shot you, so for the most part, if I was gonna get this guy down, I would have to dodge almost every attack. I was thinking that for the last boss there would be a much bigger need for ammo than I actually anticipated, so I refrained from using my ammo boxes here as much as possible, which was honestly a mistake. After too many runs of getting hit with some sly move or something that I messed up, I really had to rethink using those ammo boxes. This through the whole run was probably the hardest on ammo. This boss only drops pickups when it summons these towers out of the ground, and then there's only a small chance that when they break, which happens after they attack one time, that something will drop out of it. I was getting really unlucky with the drops here, and probably could have completed this fight in much fewer tries had I actually started off thinking to use ammo boxes. By this point in the run, I was also feeling kind of burned out, as it was getting to be around 7 hours straight, almost of pretty much just boss rushes. So at this point, I was a bit sluggish as well, and couldn't really get my dodge timing down sometimes. I still decided to persist through this fight because most times I'm too stubborn to quit, but I gotta respect this boss a bit, as, like I said, this boss isn't using anything complex as far as its moveset goes, so the fact that this boss usually stumps me in difficult situations more often than not is pretty impressive, considering some of the other fights in this game. I was finally able to nail this one down and get to the final boss of the run, and I wasn't able to beat the last boss after over 8 hours of streaming that day, so I decided to dedicate the rest of the time offline and just record the fight off stream. So, here we are. The last fight of the game. This was tough. This boss alone probably took me 2 to 3 hours of tries or so. A really tough modifier was put on this boss being vicious. This made the boss pretty much hit for all my health on most of their moves, especially since this boss already hits very hard. The strategy for this one was at first to do as much damage as possible and get through the fight quickly. There were many attempts with this in mind, and it didn't end up working out almost at all. With that, I had an idea. There's a ring in the game called the Black Cat Band, which can be purchased in town for 500 scrap. This would prevent me from dying had I suffered something that would have taken all of my health. This was the thing that helped a ton during this fight. During many parts of this, the boss summons orbs that, after a short delay, will track you. If any one of those hit, it was game over. Typically, before the second phase, this boss summons about 6 of these in 3 pairs, so if I take out one in the pair, both would go down. However, something that really hindered me and got me killed many times during this fight was the fact that these orbs tend to glitch as a part of this boss's mechanic and phase out of my bullet as soon as I attempted to shoot, which, using the sure shot, I only had 1 bullet and then a reload, so the timing here was very important. Learning the timing, I had to really focus on them and making sure that they hadn't done their phase out already before wasting my bullet, because if I hadn't, there were many times that would be the end of a run. Sometimes I did get lucky and all the orbs came at me at once with a single well-timed dodge. I could avoid the damage. This didn't happen too often, but when it did, you could be sure that I wasn't complaining about it. When this boss gets down to their second phase, they do this multi-dimensional type of mechanic where they pause and then put you in one dimension, then once they do a certain move or after a certain number of time, they put you back where you were in the other dimension. This is a very disorienting experience, so I had to make sure I was ready for an attack at any point. When you get put into the second dimension, the boss still does the orbs in there, but with much more than just 6 like they normally do outside that place, so this caused many issues because I had to make sure that I was dodging the area-wide attack in there to not get stunned and hitting the orbs as well to ensure that it didn't get taken out when they all decided to come at me. In total, this boss actually has technically 3 phases, but the last one isn't really much of a phase and can be done pretty easily with the arc gun, as the ghost type enemies in that phase can be taken down in a single shot. I wasn't worried so much about that part really, as I knew once the boss had been taken down, that was the easy part. With some serious persistence and a few different strategy revisions, I got to this point in the game overall in under 20 hours total of gameplay. That is including the ending and beating this boss. As I reflect back on the journey of this challenge, I really enjoyed myself here. Some of these encounters were very tough and frustrating, while others were actually really intuitive and gave me something to ponder with my approach given the options that I had. There was no initial testing here, or research into whether there was going to be anything that would stop this run from being possible. I just had an idea and said, let's do it. Being the first challenge run I have ever attempted myself, I gotta say that I'm proud of myself for pushing through this and really challenging myself to do something that normally I wouldn't do. With these kind of games, I enjoy the challenge of just going through them and learning things with the normal weapons and items. This game has a very diverse range of options when it comes to builds and weapon styles, so being limited to secondaries was a very big change for me, especially due to them being more of support damage in this game and not really meant for being primary damage in most occasions. There were many times during this run I almost messed up. As you will recall, one of the rules of this challenge was that if I had done any damage other than secondary, I would have to restart the whole run with a brand new character. I can't tell you how many times I accidentally meleeed and missed the enemy not doing damage. This was so risky, and I really thought that I was going to have to restart many times during this challenge. Also, when I set up the rules, I was anticipating that the cube gun would be more useful than it actually was. I ended up never actually even getting it. Doing things like this makes you realize things about a game that you never normally would. Typically, I don't think about how much ammo these bosses actually drop during their fight on a regular basis, and how each encounter does so in different ways, so this was a very fresh perspective, and I enjoyed that. So, while the rule was there, it really wasn't as applicable as I was thinking that it would be. I also did this run on Nightmare instead of Veteran, which was the minimum difficulty I made for the rules of the run. Really, this rule was only in place in case I had many attempts and had to restart, then bump the difficulty down a bit so that the run would go smoother. Typically, Nightmare and up is reserved for characters that are more built out and actually have a full set of gear, so it was good that I was able to push through this with just secondary weapons. I was really nervous about having to restart, honestly, because that would be a much bigger investment of time than I wanted. Initially, when I thought about this challenge in my head, I was thinking I could get most of this done in a single stream, or even finish partway through at most 2 streams. The bulk of this took 2 full 8-hour streams and then 3 hours of recordings for the final boss, which resulted in around a 19-hour run in total. I'm so glad that I was able to finish in that amount of time, and there were no restarts that had to occur, even though I was anticipating that may happen. I really enjoyed this challenge overall, even through the frustrating moments, and I think as a person, this really helped me see a new perspective, not only on this game, but overall. If you made it this far into the video, I really appreciate you sticking this one out with me. It means a lot, especially because this took a lot of time. So if you like this kind of thing, let me know. Comment your most difficult encounter in this game, or just your thoughts on my challenge, and like the video and maybe consider subscribing so it can reach more people like you and they can share in this experience. I wanted to say thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.